Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for dialing in. Now, long before ESG became a buzzword, before AI was on everyone's co-pilot, Aristotle was already asking, how do we teach people to do good, not just to know good? 2,000 years later, that question's back, and this time it's got data, investors, and deadlines attached. Every pioneer has a spark. For Terry Thornton, that spark lit long before ESG ever reached the boardroom. From early experiments in online learning to shaping global sustainability curriculum, his story runs right through the evolution of how we learn to change the world. Terry, it's wonderful to have you with us. Take us back, if you would, back to that beginning. What moments, people, challenges pulled you towards this intersection of learning, technology, and sustainability?
Thanks, Jonathan. Thank you very much. Great to be here. Great to be here to talk about this. For me, it's very personal. This wasn't a career decision. It was a personal decision, and that started as a child. So I'm what is known as a child of deaf adults, CODA. There's a movie called Coda. It's great, but we have this name because we experience childhood in a similar way, right? We're hearing, we grow up with deaf parents that we sign to, but we can't really speak to. So as you can imagine, in terms of going to school, getting a head start, learning how to read, all that happens before you go to school. So my parents recognizing this, um, saved up money they didn't have. And they, I got one of the first televisions that got one of those closed captionings, right? So that's literally how I learned to read. They put on my favorite educational show, Sesame Street, well known here in the States. Uh, and just imagine the most popular education show from when you're a child, right? Imagine that show. That was me in front of it, hours and hours throughout the day, learning to read, having these characters teach me to read, right? So that was my experience. That's my first experience in education technology. And for me, it was as impactful as, let's say, the printing press, right? That's how impactful it was for me. Entering school at the same level as all my peers and not being left behind, right? The inclusivity, right? So education technology is very much a core of who I am, right? It really, really drives me. And so fast forward throughout my career, um, back then, education technology wasn't really a career. So naturally, I went into teaching, right? And this is where the ESG part comes in, right? So I've always worn these two hats, ESG and learning technology. So I'm a teacher just out of university. I'm in a school around where I grew up, low resource school, struggling to, buy books, struggling for school supplies. And this is in Washington, D.C., where I grew up. And when I walk out of the school, and this is a pivotal moment for me, when I walk out of the school, I look around and I can see skyscrapers in the distance, not too far away, right? These are some of the most powerful government agencies in the world, some of those powerful corporations in the world, all occupying the same space. Yet there's so much capital there and so little in this school. I became obsessed. What are the systems at play? Why the disconnect, right? Why is there no vested interest in this school right down the street for them? So while we occupied the same space, it was really like we were different planets. And that's where this idea of social investment, ESG, there are a lot of terms. You've been in this long enough. ESG is the most current. It's actually getting back to sustainability. But whatever you want to call that, right, that impact with stakeholders outside the business, that I became obsessed with. So I stopped being a teacher. Well, actually, I'm still a teacher in many, many ways, but a teacher with education technology. And that's where I said this niche area, and it was niche back then, right? Not too many people knew about this. Back then, I said I want to spread the word, right? And that became my career.
Fantastic. Terry, it's such a powerful journey from closed captions to global classrooms. And Coda, I've put that on my wish list. That's the next movie I'm watching. You've called that moment your printing press. So how did
Mhm.
that spark or that realization that learning could scale begin to shape your sense of sustainability and responsibility?
Well, for it to spread, it couldn't just be local, right? It couldn't just be region specific. How do you get outside? And that's what pushed me to go outside the classroom, right? How do you get to society at large? And how do you scale education? Education at the time wasn't very scalable, right? Um, then came e-learning. And I said, this is it, right? E-learning. I learned to learn. I learned to read and learn through a screen. Others can too. And this is a subject I'm passionate about. So this is the way. And so in the beginning, creating e-learning courses, and we can talk about, I mean, if folks are old enough to remember, e-learning wasn't a thing. It was mocked. It was how do you learn from a screen? That's impossible. Real learning happens in the classroom. And um, in the face of all that, building some of the first e-learning courses, the first two actually worldwide in terms of sustainability and ESG. So that's where I got my start. And I said, e-learning is the way to go. And saying no to in-person training, people called me crazy. They're like, no, we'll pay you for in-person training. I said, I'm not doing it. I'm going to say, this is silly. I'm going to say no to your money, but will you buy these courses instead? And they said no initially, but eventually we got there. Eventually we got there.
Well, that must have felt like, uncharted territory then, Terry, not just building content, but trying to prove that learning through a screen could actually
Mhm.
change how people act.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly right. And that evolution never stopped. Because now as e-learning, and this gets us right into the AI topic, right? As e-learning became standardized and normalized, well, what's the next evolution of that? And for me in my journey and my focus, it's evolved along with it, right? So I've been working on AI enabled learning tools around sustainability for a few years now, because that is the next evolution. And we can certainly talk about what that evolution looks like, because 10 years ago, when I created my first course, it took 8 months to create one 3-hour course.
Oh, ouch. 8 months. So, how did you define ESG for learners back then? This is 10 years ago,
Mhm.
before all of the buzz, before it became part of everyone's vocabulary. You
Yeah.
said ESG means something different to everyone. So the CEO,
Mhm.
HR lead, investor. So what does that tell us about how we need to teach it? I'm assuming there's business leaders on the call. How do you make ESG learning something that drives
Mhm.
value in their organizations and it's not just a compliance tool?
ESG, sustainability, social investment, ethical investment. I can go on. There's a dozen terms, and each term kind of reflects the person using it and how they view it. It's because it's not a static set thing, right? And we have a lot of ESG data, and it's getting better and better and better, right? But it's not 100% yet. So there's the ambiguity, and the reason there's ambiguity is because ESG touches everything, right? There's a little bit of ESG in every single role. So if you're an accountant, you're looking at ESG one way. If you're a CEO, you're looking at it a different way. If you're in the supply chain, it's completely different. If you're in PR, different there. Industries, right? Oil and gas, consulting, mining, all those industries have different ESG priorities, right? So when you think about learning about ESG, how can you, and I'm guilty of this because of the limitation of the technology back then, how can you teach everyone just ESG? One generic off-the-shelf course when it means something different to everyone. It doesn't work that way. But that's what we had back then because we didn't have anything dynamic to learn with different roles. So when you're thinking about the impact of learning, and I will get into some learning theory here. Folks on the call, you came for AI and ESG. You're going to get a little bit of learning theory thrown in here as well. When you think about what you learn and use and learn by doing, if you learn something once and you don't use it within 5 days, it's 90% gone. You're not going to get it back. And then it's not in practice, it doesn't stick with you, and you're not using it. But that's how ESG learning back then, and unfortunately, a lot of it is now, right? It's very much here's E, here's S, here's G. Take this knowledge, try to make sense of it, try to use up your brain power, try to make sense of it, how it relates to your role, and then go use it in your role, maybe one week down the road, 2 months down the road, 6 months down the road, whenever it might pop up, right? It doesn't work that way, right? So for businesses, especially when you're looking at ESG learning, you have to look at it through that lens, right? Is this something to check off a box and say you did, which a lot of compliance is, which is fine. It's, you can look at it like a cost center, right? We just pay the money, check the box. But when you look at it as a differentiator, then it becomes an investment. And that investment requires learning per role, learning about how ESG really impacts those roles and what it means to them. So when to take a step back when you first asked, what does ESG really mean? When I look at ESG, I try to simplify it, right? There's a lot of definitions, there's a lot of terms. What it really is just a series of a lot of different impacts from a lot of different stakeholders. And how do we measure that in terms of the bottom line for a company? All these different impacts, all these different relationships that typically aren't measured are now being asked to measured, or they're still not being measured, and you might get a surprise. Now, I'm going to throw in another term here. Um, my favorite term in talking about ESG is preventable surprises. I got it from a think tank called Preventable Surprises, and it's a brilliant term because what happens when you're not really teaching ESG per role and having them understand how it means to their role, there are impacts that are going unmeasured, and then impacts that might go wrong, and then there's your surprise, right? CEOs don't like that phrase, and leaders, I always use this phrase for leaders because they perk up, preventable surprises. And then also, I know there's ESG folks on the call. You have to talk about opportunities. ESG is not just risk, it's opportunity as well. So I just threw a lot at you, going from one place to another. But they all link in that way. It's really about the role specific, understanding those impacts, and then finding the risks and the opportunities associated with that. And that's the differentiator. That's what keeps it from being a cost center.
Yeah, no, I love that. There's a lot to unpack there, Terry, and I think we'll get into that more because I love that preventative surprises. Um, so when we have spoken earlier, you said about professional learning and how it's been outpaced by how we learn at home. I want to dial it back maybe to that or that AI question, because at
Yeah.
home, instant, personalized, practical. What does that shift mean for how we build ESG capability inside an organization?
Um, it is far out past. I'll give businesses credit. They are keeping up a little bit. You're starting to see enterprise-wide ChatGPT licenses and things like that. But it's still not to the level of how we learn at home. And for good and not and some not so good reasons. For example, at home, if you have a kitchen, you can just pop in ChatGPT, some Gen AI tools say, I have these ingredients in my kitchen. What can I make? How tailored is that, right? Tailored to my kitchen, exactly my needs, and I can make a meal straight from that. The equivalent of that is a little bit lacking in the professional world, right? It's still, you go over here, you take your learning, you come back to work, and then you try and use that learning at some point. There's that gap. And I mentioned this a little bit before. You go over here, you do the learning, you come back, and the learning's not happening where you're working. So there's that gap where, if you don't use it within 5 days, 90% is gone. You're using up a lot of energy, a lot of time, a lot of mental energy to use it. And you're not doing that at home. So the more and more you're learning a certain way at home with the new explosion of AI, even less you're getting out of traditional professional learning. So in terms of professional learning, um, you really have to look at the new tools and the new delivery, but there's an extra element here, right? The stakes are different, right? If you mess up the meal at home, no big deal. You might go hungry a little bit, right? But if you mess up at work using AI, that's another story, right? So it's not just getting the chat GPT, getting the license and throw it in, right? It's not just getting the tools, throw it at the ESG problem that you might have. It's not about that. It's about finding the right content because now you can deliver it at the right time, right? The right content at the right time. The challenge now is the right content. So when I talk to businesses, when I consult with them, when I speak at these conferences, I tell them, look at the content and the data and go beyond it and make sure that's correct. It's not throwing these fancy AI tools at them. They go in balance, right?
Mm.
So there's a little bit of difference on how we learn at home, But the expectation is we should be able to learn that way. And it takes a little bit more time and investment to get there.
Yeah, that's a key word. I want to touch on that expectations, because it's what people expect when they're at home. Do they expect that in their workplace as well? And I
Mhm.
know that you've been experimenting with this in education. So, I mean, what does it look like in practice, Terry? How far ahead are we?
Uh, we're not there yet. We will be, well, how fast we're coming. So I'll give you an example. 10 years ago, I created a sustainability course for wealth advisors, right? High net worth clients and wealth advisors that were new to ESG, don't really know about it. Take the course, they can talk to their clients about it. So that course, right? I'm outing myself here. Here's E, here's S, here's G, right? But back then, custom was a very expensive word, right? If you wanted to customize something for your business, for yourself, it took months, weeks of scoping, months of building just to make that tailor-made, right? AI has changed that. And this is a good example of how. So that course I created one scenario for a wealth advisor. It was state of the art back then. I had a person come up, a static person, doesn't move, and then a voiceover over it. This is cutting edge back then. Voiceover over it, describing a situation, playing out a role play coming at you where you're not interacting with it at all. And it was just one scenario. And then recently, one of my favorite companies, ED4S, I'm engaging with them, I'm learning about what they're doing, we're helping each other. And they created a course for wealth advisors around sustainability, the same topic, but through a AI simulator. And so instead of one scenario that's static and doesn't change for months or even years, you can get 1,000, right? You can have 1,000 different scenarios. And in this context, it's important because clients are diverse, right? They all have different motivations, especially in ESG. They might be values driven. They might think ESG is the differentiator in terms of revenue and profit for their investments. They might have a green, mission. There are all these different motivations with ESG. In my course 10 years ago, couldn't even come close to matching that doing that needs to happen with the wealth advisor and their client. But this tool does, and it's fantastic. So you can go in, you play with it, you practice these scenarios. You can tell it, my client might want to talk about water, water investments. Boom, you have that conversation. And it gets better over time, right? It's learning and getting better over time. So that's a clear example about where it's
Mm.
been and where it's going. And those type of tools are going to explode. And so, and I might pivot to this topic right now because I think it's important. Content, right? Content for the sake of content, generic content is dead. You can get any Gen AI to produce a course, produce anything off the shelf. You throw it into e-learning and you can sell it, all right? Or you can go take it or whatever, right? What it really comes down to is that understanding that role specificity, and the ability to deliver valid, credible content at the right time, right? So when you're looking at content, whether you're trying to get into ESG or you want to enhance your role with ESG, you want an ESG role, you're a business leader looking at courses for your folks. It's really important to kind of get through the noise of all the stuff, all the AI stuff out there. So I said I created the first two e-learning courses around ESG in the world. Now, 2 years ago, there's over 2,000. I can't even count now with AI being more mainstream. So you can say, I think I'm safe in saying there's like 10,000 courses out there. I think I'm safe in saying that. How do you sort that, right? And you need to go back to what you and I are talking about, this role tailor-made specificity where it really impacts and sticks with you and enhances your work and helps you stand out.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fascinating evolution, 2 to 2,000 and 10,000 and beyond. I mean, from
Hmm.
static courses to dynamic stimulation, they'll learn alongside the user. I mean, it reminds me a lot of a company I admire in the ESG space, Nature Broking over in London.
Hmm.
They talk about teaching markets to value nature and climate mitigation. Would you say your work is doing something similar in helping people learn to value sustainability as a skill, not just, a box to be ticked?
I think where that gets into, and great companies like Nature Broker, ED4S, several others, is getting to that. And I'll use an acronym. I'm from Washington, D.C., which is literally an acronym. We speak in acronyms. I'll use one here. BAU, business as usual, right? And that's where true innovation comes. Innovation is removing layers. It's not adding them, right? And we can get into innovation paradox, but in a sense, there's a lot of technology that can clutter. There's a lot of stuff that can clutter what you're trying to accomplish and that make it more difficult. But when you see folks like Nature Brokers, ED4S, others that are using technology and using strategies to make it easy, to make it approachable, to make it tailor-made, to really make it BAU, that's where the value really unlocks. And so the more and more you do ESG as in just inherent part of what you do, right? Or in how you look at, for example, nature, right? Nature's just what we look at now, right? We look at our impacts there. That's just what we do. And you make that easy, then it sticks, and then that competitive advantage starts to come out. So you might hear me say BAU all the time because that's what I strive for, right? When I'm consulting, I'm not giving you a fancy new platform, right? Or fancy new extra apps. If I do, it's part of your workflow, right? It's something that you will be using as a part of what you're trying to achieve. So the average person in a work week uses like 150 apps. From home. And then if you're adding another one in there, it's really a tall ask. So I push everyone to really look at that business as usual. And that's where really culture comes from, right? Culture is not a thing that you have to strive to do extra. There's a lot of investment in culture up front to build it and have it be BAU. But once it's BAU, it's just how you do things. That's where ESG needs to be as well.
Yeah, when you bake it in. BAU, and something else I hear you say a lot is that, learning only matters if it leads to doing, Terry. So,
Hmm.
what does that mean for companies trying to build that ESG fluency when at the moment, a lot of organizations are just drowning in the data and the training models that are being thrown at them, which might not
Hmm.
be as personalized and specific as you've described the need for.
Yep, yeah, yep. Um, ESG hits a lot of, especially large companies, a lot of different departments, right? And it's really hard in anything, not just ESG, to pull all these departments together to be on the same page about anything. Um, but that's where, when you look at learning, you help standardize that language, you help standardize that understanding. And what I'm describing was innovative several years ago, but now you have to elevate that. It's not just having a standard, everyone understands this about ESG as we're talking. So, um, and it's difficult. I can give you a few lines and say, oh yeah, just do X, Y, and Z and you'll solve it. That'd be wrong. It's very, very difficult to cut through the noise, right? And that requires having the right resources, the right people to help drive the AI, right? So that's where, especially for our ESG folks, you have to understand how AI delivers content and be the one delivering it, right? So, and not, and I'll keep going back to this, don't just buy tools and throw it on top, right? It's just, that's not going to do it. You really need the folks to really drive the AI. And if you're not that person, be that person, right? If there isn't any tailor-made content for your role, create it. It's easier than ever. And then be the owner of it. And that's, another way you stand out. So empowerment really in organizations for folks to take ESG, share the knowledge about their role or understand it about their role, leave room for that empowerment is the way you kind of cut through all the noise.
Yeah. I mean, blended in with that idea, I guess, is connecting the learning directly to the job that you do. I think that weaves its way in. I mean, that almost feels like the missing link in a lot of this corporate ESG training.
Mhm.
I mean, how do leaders then design learning that changes the behavior and not just the understanding?
I think it becomes when the learning is just natural, right? Like, it's also kind of like a marketing strategy, right? When when you're pitching, it should be something they just get instantly, right? If they just get it, then they're listening. If you're explaining why they should get it, they're going to tune out, right? And the reason they get what they're listening to is because it relates to them, right? So it's really about tailoring the content, understanding that content, and having it just be instinctual. And the way you do that, and I joke about this, and it's a little cliche, but I like it. I want to put myself out of a job, right? ESG as a separate topic to learn, right? At some point, ideally, it's just part of business 101. It's just part of what you learn. You learn spreadsheets, you learn management 101, ESG 101, all is entwined and indistinguishable with each other. And that's just the way it is, right? There is no more ESG course on this, right? So I like to say, I'd like to put myself out of business someday, but that's the evolution, right? And if you're a company looking at ESG as a differentiator, that's how you need to treat it. It's not something extra special. Then it becomes a marketing exercise, right? It's really about this is intrinsic to what we do, so this is how we teach it, right? Onboarding, everyone's onboarding, continual education. Everyone has education baked into, I need, X course, this growth opportunity. Just make it intrinsic to all that. KPIs. There are so many avenues to just integrate ESG into where it just becomes indistinguishable from the other thing. So that's what I persuade many corporations to do is look at it as just the same as the way you teach every other valuable skill.
So building on that then, Terry, I mean, I heard you talk about middle layer as well of learning kind of disappearing. Those
Mm,
long courses that don't teach enough or act on not enough that matters. So
mhm.
what replaces that?
So, when I talk about this subject, it's the evolution of how we're learning because we can learn by doing more than we ever could before, right? It was very hard to learn by doing before. Apprentice and internship programs where you physically have to go somewhere and learn and shadow someone, right? That's learning by doing back then. Now you can get a lot of that great content on demand wherever you are, right? On your phone. If I have to learn how to change the oil in my car, I can just get it on my phone, right? And then that's how I learn how to do it. I don't go read a book about it and hopefully someday I can remember how to change the oil in my car. But it's on demand, it's accessible. And so where that really elevates and changes things, it's um, using these tools in a way that makes sense for your role. And so I went on a rant about my auto example. So let me get back to your question again, if you can rephrase it.
My question was around the middle layer. There's a
Yes.
lot of content out there. I mean, I'm going to add in something. I'll throw in a curveball there.
Oh,
Yeah, there's a
please.
lot of generic ESG content out there. Is that a waste of time and money potentially at this point in time?
Well, it was the only way to do things, and I'm responsible for starting that. I'm responsible for a lot, kicking off that wave of generic ESG content because that was the limitation. And so it was very much, here's your static content. You go, you take it, and you try and bring it back, right? But now that we have learned by doing, and as I was saying with, my examples, it's so readily available. That's the expectation. So that's what you should be doing. You should be learning by doing, and it's more accessible than ever. So there's that end of it, but then you look at the other end. The other end of the spectrum is true expertise, right? You don't get true expertise just by learning by doing. You get theoretical. You understand the field. You get, the college degree, the advanced certification. You go really, really deep with it, right? And that is absolutely needed, right? And a lot of times, those are the folks that are going to be driving that credible content that I'm talking about that needs to be driven into AI tools, right? You need that expertise. You need the certification. You need the badge that says, this verifies I know this stuff, right? So you have two ends of the spectrum. You have the doing and you have the expertise that's validated through associations and accreditations. Then what happens to that middle, right? That middle of you're not learning by doing. Here's a lot of content, right? Here's E, here's S, here's G. You're sitting at it, sometimes it's 3 or 4 hours. You're sitting there taking a course, or even it's 1 hour. What is that doing for you, right? What is that doing for you that one end of the spectrum, the learning by doing, or the other, gaining true expertise, right? And having that be credentialed. It doesn't do either very well, right? But that's where the vast majority of the content is. And it's also the easiest to make with AI, right? It's the easiest to make. with AI. And that's what I'm talking about when I talk about like 10,000 courses, right? There's so much stuff out there that's just regurgitated. It goes into the internet, takes it out, turns it into a course, and here you go. And that's a lot of that middle layer. So when you're a business and you're thinking about training your folks and you see these courses, right? Oh, it's in this library of courses, like they can go and take it. I would argue, and you brought it up, it's a waste of time. It's a waste of money. Unless it checks that box, it's great. You got your report checked off, right? You got your annual thing. You paid for that check. All right, that's worth whatever you paid for it is worth that check. But if you're looking at it as an investment, right, to go beyond, those courses really aren't going to get you there.
Yeah, provocative stuff. Right, Terry, I think, given the time, and the time has flown. I've loved this
Mhm.
conversation. Now it's time for that crystal ball. If you could design the future of ESG learning, say 5 years from now, given the pace that everything's going at,
Mhm.
what would you want it to look like?
And I'll go back to this again and really dig in a little deeper. It's the business 101. It's not there's no ESG profession. It's just business. And the ESG are, my fellow ESG experts out there are the ones that are driving that, right? And they're driving that content and they're making it BAU, right? And it's not a separate thing, something that can be used as a political target, or it can be used, or is uh, changed in the way it's viewed, right? So, there are a lot of views on ESG. There's a lot of good views, a lot of bad views, but it's all based on how that person or that role sees ESG. And that adds to the confusion. And what my vision of the future is no more confusion. We all understand that ESG is something different to everyone, and it means something different to everyone in every role. And we can measure it, we can make great decisions with it, no preventable surprises, lots of opportunities unlocked, and lots of great learning and BAU and culture driven by ESG. So that's my on the pedestal. That's my vision for the next 5 years.
Fantastic. Terry, you've taken us on an amazing journey, all the way from Sesame Street to AI simulators and closed captions to open possibilities. If there's one thing you'd like everyone listening to take away from this conversation, you spoke about BAU as preventable surprises, but just that one thing, what would that be, sir?
Um, this is a question I love to ask audiences themselves, right? I go and the other day I did a conference with 400 folks in the audience, and I asked them, uh, raise your hand on a scale of one, two, and three. Put up a number. One is I have no idea what ESG means to my role. Two, I have a somewhat understanding of what ESG means to my role. Or three, I absolutely understand how ESG relates to my role. Or I'm an ESG professional. I know exactly where it's going to be in 3 or 4 years, right? Raise your hand. Lots of ones and twos, not a single three. And even my ESG folks, my people are in there, and, the experts, they don't know where it's going in 5 years. So the challenge is to get to a three, to get to that understanding of how ESG relates to your role. And when you have an understanding of that, you know what content to look for, right? So don't go content first. Don't go, I need ESG. Oh, that looks good. Or that's credible. Or that comes from that, brand or whatever it is. Understand your role, how ESG relates to it, and then get the technology, then get the course that matches that ambition. And if it doesn't exist, go create it.
There you go. I love that. And please grab some water, Terry, while you can.
Yeah.
But I love that grounding. It's practical, empowering, and also person-centric. Terry, thank you so much for sharing your story, your insights, and your remarkable journey with us today. Absolutely loved it. And thank you also to everyone dialing in and joining us for this conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. I know there are some questions which people have sent through, and please keep your laptops open on LinkedIn, and we'll go through and answer as many of those as we can, or send them back to you personally with Terry's answers and insights around that. But from everybody from our side, Terry, it's been an absolute pleasure. And the audience there, thank you so much for your participation. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.